Today's daf,
No good.
Chavav, which is 26, and we are at the bottom of 25b. We just saw machlokas between Abai and Rava in somebody who had a lack of intent in regards to something that's prohibited in benefit, whether that's permissible or prohibited, whether something is not a lack of intent, but there's no way to avoid it. So in the first version, everybody agreed when somebody is intending to benefit, even though even though that he couldn't avoid it, everybody agree that it's prohibited because you're intending. And when there's no intent and you can't avoid it, everybody would agree it's okay. The machlokas between Abai and Rava are according to Rabbi Shimon's opinion, who says that in general you need intent in order to transgress. Here, here even without intent, since you could avoid it and you didn't, that's going to count as intent. We have a different version of what the machlokas between Abai and Rava is, and in this regard. So the Gemara says, Ika de Amri. There are those that say, and this is about 7-8 lines from the bottom of 25b, Chaf Hayamid base. Ika de Amri. Efsher v'lo mechave. If somebody is able to, but has no intent, meaning he could avoid it, and has no intent to benefit from it. That's the simple machlokas of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, where Rabbi Yehuda says intent is not necessary in order to transgress, and Rabbi Shimon says you're only transgressing it with intent. So the intention would always apply here. If one cannot avoid it and also has no intention, and even Rabbi Yehuda would agree. Rabbi Yehuda, who generally says you don't need intent in order to transgress, would agree that when you don't have intent and cannot avoid it, that's totally permissible, because you're not trying to do the transgression and you're not intending for it, and you don't have you have no ability to avoid it. Ki pligi. So where's the machlokes? Dulay efshar. You don't have any other way to get to where you need to go besides for walking past the bakery on Pesach. But once you're walking by, you might as well enjoy it. So you take a sniff. So you're intending to benefit. And this is on the basis of Rabbi Shimon, who says generally that you need intention. And once you intend, you transgress. Over here, you're intending. Rabbi Shimon follows your intent. So then everybody would hold that it's prohibited. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that generally you don't need intent, does that mean that it's a leniency as well? It's not. We're not concerned with your intent, and the only consideration we have is whether you could avoid it or not. Because Rabbi Yehuda says perhaps that there is no distinction between whether you intend or not, because that's not of significance. So then, efshar, usher, if you could avoid it, it's going to be prohibited. Abaye Rabbi Yehuda, Abaye says like Rabbi Yehuda, Rava Rabbi Shimon, and Rava says like Rabbi Shimon. And now we're at the top of Chavav, Amar Aleph. So Rava says to you, Ad kan leka Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Even in Rabbi Yehuda's, I would say that Rabbi Yehuda would agree to us. She'ein mischaven k'mischaven. Even though that he says that when you don't intend, it counts as if you intend, and therefore you would transgress even without the intention, since you did the action. But that's only in order to be strict. But to say that when you intend to do the action, it's going to count as if you didn't intend because you had no choice. Lakula, in order to be lenient, like that Rabbi Yehuda never said. So Rabbi Yehuda's Rava, the way I would reword Rava is that Rabbi Yehuda is not saying that intention is not a matter of concern. Rabbi Yehuda is saying if you did the action Even if you didn't intend, you transgress. But of course, even if you couldn't avoid it, if you intended, you also transgress. Amar Abai Me'onami. So Abai says, how can I prove to you that since you cannot avoid it, even if you intend, it would be permissible? The Tanya, I can prove it to you from a brisa. Amru alav al Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It was said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived at the end of the Beis Hamikdash and the generation of the destruction. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would teach. The halacha is that during the pilgrimages, during the Aliyah L'Regel, the Yom Tovim, so you have to teach about the Chag to the people celebrating the Chag. And people would come up to Yerushalayim, and there was an enormous amount of people. And in order to get some shade, and with a large plaza where you can teach a lot of people, what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would do, he'd gather the people in the courtyard in front of the Beis Hamikdash. And there was a large area that could benefit from the very tall walls of the Beis Hamikdash, which are 100 feet, 100 amma high, about 150 feet high. So that gave some shade, and he would teach over there. Now he's benefiting from the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. You're not allowed to benefit from the Beis Hamikdash. He's benefiting from the shade of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. He would sit in the shade of the Heichal, and this way he would be able to sit and teach for many hours at a time without keeping people in the sun, in direct sunlight, because they had shade of the wall. Now, but over here, the loy efsher, he cannot avoid it because there was no other place to gather all the people that came for the pilgrimage. They were up there on the Temple Mount anyhow. They're on the Beis Hamikdash, and you need a plaza that's large enough, and you need some shade. So you have no other option. V'shari, and it was permissible. So you see that it's permissible to benefit from something, even though he's intending, since there's no option, there's no other way of doing it. But Rava says, Omar, no, that's not the idea over there. The reason wasn't because he couldn't avoid it. The reason is he's not benefiting it in a typical way. The structure of walls and a building are not made for shade on its outside. It's made for protection of the inside. That's what a house is. That's what a building is. That's what a dwelling is. So you can't say. So he's benefiting from it, but in an abnormal way. And that's why it was permissible, as we saw yesterday, that hana benefit in a manner that's not typical with the usage of that item is going to be permissible. So here too as well, it's permissible. Amar Rava Menamina. Rava says, and how can I prove my idea that the Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that since you intended, it's going to be prohibited, even though you couldn't avoid it. The Tananas we learned, Lulun Pesuchim ba'ali beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. In the Beis HaMikdash, in the Holy of Holies, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, even a Kohen Gadol can only go in a certain structure on a certain day of the year on Yom Kippur. So if you needed to do repairs, the repair people in the Beis HaMikdash would go in through a box, through a window in the roof. And they would lower down in a box, the craftsman who would be repairing it, so their eyes not satiate themselves from looking at the beauty of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now, so Rava understands this to be in order to avoid the benefit of something that is Kodesh. So there's no way to avoid it because they have to do the repairs, so they have to be in there. And the concern is that they may intend to benefit and enjoy the look around. And it was prohibited, so they didn't allow them in a regular way. You had to go in through this box, through a window, to avoid it. So you see that since you intend, even though you have no ability to avoid it, nevertheless you're going to be chayiv. So Gemara says, "V'tisbra, wait, is that really the reason that they did so? Was it because if they had looked around, they would have transgressed, benefiting from Kodesh in a prohibited way?" Va'amar Reb Shimon ben Pazi al Reb Shua ben Levi, but Reb Shimon ben Pazi said in the name of Reb Shua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara, in the name of bar Kapara, Kol, looking at something beautiful, listening to the sound of something beautiful, Umare, and looking at something that's beautiful, V'reach, and the aroma of something, Ein behem mishum me'ila. That would not count as misusing the Kodesh. It's not misusing Kodesh, which was called Me'ila, and there's a transgression as well as a carbon to bring, and could be punishment. So the concept of Me'ila, of misusing Hekdesh, would not apply to looking at the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash, right? That's Mara, or Kollel, or hearing the sounds of the Leviim playing with the holy instruments. Of course, these are not misuse of the Beis HaMikdash, of Kodesh, because these are non-tangible things. So too, Reach, the scent, the aroma. In any case, the reason that the repair people going into the craftsmen, going into the Holy of Holies, needed to go in a box is not because they were going to look, because looking would not be a prohibition. But rather due to the intense holiness of that particular place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it was a stringency done to say, look, don't look. We don't want anybody looking around. Just do your work, and in this box that you come and that was lower down from above. Some say Rava said his source from somewhere else. The Tani we learned that generally we say that looking at something beautiful, listening to something beautiful, or smelling something nice, there's no transgression of me'ila, which is a severe transgression of misuse of benefiting from Kodesh, which has a carbon, as we said, that you have to bring as a part of your atonement, and there could be lashes, etc. So me'ilahu daleka. So he's inferring you don't have the transgression of me'ilah, which is this more severe transgression. Ha'isura ikka, but it is prohibited. And now these are things that are unavoidable. You hear the sounds of the Levi; they're unavoidable. But you're intending to enjoy it. You're intending to listen, and it would be prohibited. My lav lo isna imne b'fnim. Wouldn't you say it's about people that are standing inside the Beis HaMikdash to do the service? So that's unavoidable for them. They can't not look. They can't not hear. They can't not smell. These are things that they're in the inside. These are unavoidable, and yet it's prohibited for them to benefit, to intend to benefit. Delay afshar, where it's impossible for them to avoid it, and since they're intending, it's going to be usher. So Gemara says, it's for people standing outside. Inside, they indeed would be permissible. Abai says, it's only for people outside who could avoid it, and they're making an effort to look and see and enjoy it, or to hear the music, or to smell this the scent of the ketores, and that would be prohibited. So we still have machlokas here. Abaye says, if there's no way to avoid it, even though you intend to benefit, it's permissible. And Rava says, no, even though you can't avoid it, you may not intend to benefit. Gufa. So now we're going to
analyze. What does that mean if you can't avoid it, as long as you don't intend to enjoy it?
Take this last case. The Kohen is doing the service in the Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah.
Rava says he's got to go about his day and do the avoda, but he may not enjoy the music of the Leviim, because kol is prohibited, or he may not stop and say, this is amazing scent of the ketores. the incense burning, such beautiful spices, and
So
he's not allowed to.
it comes out.
Not allowed to
comes out.
intentionally benefit from it, even though he can't avoid it. He's inside. He has to do the service. He's going to see. He's going to hear, and he's going to smell, and yet he's not allowed to benefit. It's not going to count as me'ila transgression, which is the severe, which is punishable by bringing a carbon in as atonement, etc. But he's not allowed to benefit.
I hear, but I mean, on Shei Yericho, you could hear the tziltzal, and they could smell the pitum aktoris.
They're not allowed to.
Okay, but they could.
But they're not allowed to intend.
So do they have to intend not to intend? Is what I'm asking. Do they have to? I don't want to be
asking.
For this.
Yeah, we didn't see that you need a hepech kavana, intent not to. No, but you can't stop and say.
How could you smell the ketoris and not be nana from it? It was pleasurable.
Great, but you can't intend for it. You got to go on. Pesach, you walk by a bakery, you can either say, that's fantastic. Oh, let me take a sniff here. Or you can just walk by and ignore it. And that's what you need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, that's Rava's opinion that you may not intend, even though you can't avoid it, you may not intend to benefit from something that's prohibited in benefit. So Gufa, so now the Gemara is going to question this concept of there's no me'ila in sight, sound, or smell. Amar Reb Shimon Pasim Reb Shimon Levi Mishum Kapara Kol Umara V'Reach Imam Mishum Me'ila. There's no transgression of me'ila, of misuse of carbon, but of kachim in a sound, sight, or smell. So the Gemara says smell V'Reach Ein Ba Mishum Me'ila, and for smell there's no transgression of me'ila. V'Tani we learned Hamafate Mesaketoras, somebody who makes the recipe of the incense, the ketoras, and does so for himself, for his own use. So lihislamid ba or l'masr l'tzibur, if he makes the incense recipe in order to learn how to do it, or he makes it in order to gift it to the Beis HaMikdash, pater. So that's going to be, even though the Torah says you're not allowed to make the recipe, but this would be exempt because you're making it to learn how to do it or to gift it to the Beis HaMikdash. However, lahariach ba chayiv. If you made the recipe in order to smell it, that's going to be the Torah transgression of not imitating this recipe. And similarly, if somebody actually smells the incense that's burning in the community for the community, is going to be exempt from the punishment, from the transgression of me'ila, elashamal, even though that he's exempt from needing to bring a korban and the punishment. However, he did transgress the action of me'ila, and so he transgressed, but will not be held liable for it. So you see in this brisa that there is me'ila even on incense, even on a scent. How can you tell me that sight, sound, and scent and smell don't have me'ila? This brisa says that there's me'ila for smelling the communal incense burning in the Beis HaMikdash. Ela Amar of Papa. So our Papa says you're right. The first statement really is about kol umare, only about sound and sight. Smell would depend. If the smell is directly from something that still has the material there, such as the incense, where the incense as it is first put on the fire, that's something that's tangible. So there, you're smelling that. That's going to be me'ila and prohibited. If that's no longer tangible, now it's all dissipated. That scent, that aroma is where Rav Bar Kapara said there's no me'ila on that. Once the smoke from the initial placement of the initial placement of the incense on the fire, once that smoke dissipates, then the aroma in the air is permissible, and there's no me'ila because the mitzvah is already done. But the initial placement, where it's still tangible, when you have that initial pillar of smoke come up, that's going to be prohibited because you still have a tangible source of this incense, of the smell, which is prohibited to benefit from. So we now introduce a new concept, hoil v'nasis mitzvasa. The reason that the status of the incense changes is not because it becomes intangible, because the mitzvah had been done. And once the mitzvah is done, the prohibition of benefiting from it no longer exists. So now the Gemara is going to challenge that and say, wait, is that really true? That once you've done a mitzvah where you weren't allowed to benefit from the mitzvah prior, but the mitzvah is done, now you're allowed to benefit from this? Lamemra, what you're telling me is the chalahecha de nasis mitzvah, wherever a mitzvah is done, ein by mashum me'ila. There is no me'ila. Is that really true? V'harei tmerumas adeshen, the nasis mitzvah saviyesh by mashum me'ila. Well, what about the mitzvah every morning? The service of the Beis HaMikdash began with removal of some of the ash from the carbon that had burnt up on the mizbeach the night before. They would take, it's called teruma, the uplifting or the separation of hadeshen, of the ash, and they would take some of the ash, and they would put it at a specific place on the side of the mizbeach. You have to put it on the side of the mizbeach. You're not allowed to benefit from it because it has a mitzvah to put it in a specific place. So clearly, you're not allowed to benefit from the ash, even though the mitzvah's been done. Yesterday's carbon was shechted, was placed on the mizbeach, it was burnt up, the mitzvah is done, and yet you're not allowed to benefit from the ash. So it says, you shouldn't just sprinkle it around, and you must place it, so you can't benefit from it. So I see that the Torah does tell us in a particular case of the ash that even though the mitzvah is done, you're not allowed to benefit from it. So perhaps I can learn from there to all over the place that once a mitzvah is done, you're not allowed, even though a mitzvah is done, you're still not allowed to benefit from it. So Gemara says, you're right. But there's a concept that shnei ksuvim habayin ke'echad im alamdim. If there are twice, there is a concept taught twice in the Torah, then it's specific to those two places. Because if the concept was true universally, the Torah would only have to teach it once. And from there, I would learn it to all other places. From the fact that the Torah said it here, and then said it in another place, it tells me that it's not universal. It's in these two places and these two places alone. So therefore, yes, it's true that by Trumas Edeshin, the Torah tells us that you take the ash and you place it in the side of Mizbeach, telling us that even though the mitzvah has been done with the carbon, the ash is still prohibited in benefit. Because you can't just put it anywhere, you can't just sprinkle it around, you have to put it there and leave it there. Mishum, however, they have a Trumas Adeshin, the Torah teaches it here, as well as a big day kahuna, the clothing of a kohen, shtei ksuvim. These are two places the Torah says the same concept, habam ke'echad, they come as one concept, and whenever the Torah teaches us two verses, two halachas, of the two of the same halacha in two different places, it's telling us that this is not universal. It's at these two places alone. Trumas Hadeshin Adamar. And Trumas Hadeshin is where we just said that the Torah said that the ash should be placed on the side of Mizbeach. So you see, even though that the carbon had been burnt, the mitzvah has been done, nevertheless, you're not allowed to benefit. And Big Day Kahuna, and as well as the Big Day Kahuna, the Chsiv, because it says at the end of the Yom Kippur Avodah, that Aaron HaKohen would come to the Beis HaMikdash, go into the Heichal, into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and every time he went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he did the service with the Yom Kippur special 4 white garments, and when he's done with it, at the end of the day, he removes it, and he changes into the other clothing, and he removes that. And he must leave it there, place it there. Malamed, what does it mean? And he should place it there. Why does that Torah have to tell me what to do with it? Just he puts on his other clothing, and that's good. Shetu'uninganiza tells us that it must be hidden away. It may not be used again, and it's not allowed to be benefited from, even though the mitzvah has been done. So you see, twice the Torah tells us that when the mitzvah is done, you may not benefit from it. which since the Torah says it in these two places, it's unique to these two places and nowhere else. So Gemara says that would be true if everybody would agree that Hinicham Sham means that no one's allowed to benefit from it. Hanichal Rabbanan. However, that's only true according to the Rabbanan, the Amri, Melamed Shatuning and Iza, that say that halacha, that the clothing of the Kohen Gadol must be placed away. Elo Rabbi Dosa. However, there's the opinion of Rabbi Dosa, the Polygalai, who disagrees with the Chachamim, and V'amar, and he says, Aval Ru'uyin Hein LeKohen Hedyin. No Kohen Gadol may wear it again for Yom Kippur. It's each year for Yom Kippur they need a new one. That's what it means, V'nicham Sham. That it must be placed there. He may no longer wear that. The Kohen Gadol can't wear that anymore. However, the white clothing, the regular Kahanim also wear similar white clothing every day. And so some other Kohen can say, hey, I want to wear what the Kohen Gadol wore when he went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. I want to wear that for my daily service, and he can take it. So what does it mean that he places it there not to wear it and use it for another Yom Kippur, but the actual using using this would be fine. So according to this, so you don't have a second verse that tells us that once a mitzvah is done, you still prohibit in benefit, and therefore we have the first, the only place the Torah does say that, according to Rav Dosa, is in regards to the Terumas Hadeshen, where the ash from the carbon that's already completed may not be benefited from and must be placed on the side of Mizbeach. So we don't have a second verse. The Gemara says, no, we do. Because we have Trumas Hadeshen, the removal of the ash from the Mizbeach every morning, and Egla Arufa, when there's a murder found outside of a city and we don't know where who did it and where it came from, and so we measure to the closest city, and the elders of that city come out and they bring a calf there, and that calf, after it is killed at the murder site, is it may not be benefited from, even though the mitzvah is done. So we have two places that the Torah says that it may not benefit even after the mitzvah is done. And we don't learn from such a concept because you have two. Since the Torah said it in two places, that tells us it's unique to these two and nowhere else. So Gemara says, okay, that's good. However, in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, we have the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you need 3 times the Torah should say something in order for it to count as Malam, unique to these places. Twice is not sufficient. When the Torah says something 3 times, meaning 3 different halachas, the same halacha at 3 different places, that's where I could say, look, if we learned, if it was universal, the Torah wouldn't have to say it in these places, and it's unique to these 3. That's true according to the opinion that says that 2 is sufficient. That 2 is still going to be universal and teach it to everywhere, and you need 3 in order for it to be a malamdin. So what are you going to say? Well, actually, in each one of these places, by Egla Arufa and by Trumas Hadeshen, by the calf at a murder site, as well as by the ash coming off the Mizbeach, in both these places, the Torah said something that indicated it was specific to this place and nowhere else. Here it says V'samo etzam Mizbeach. It doesn't say V'sam and place, but V'samo, place it. This is something that once the mitzvah is done, even though the mitzvah is done, you're not allowed to benefit from it. And similarly by Egla Arufa, it's one of the places they're also eksiv ha'arufa. You have to leave this animal there. You cannot benefit from it. This animal, the one that was killed by its neck, which tells us that these 2 and only these 2 places, even though the mitzvah is done, you're not allowed to benefit from it. So therefore, indeed, in general, halacha is that when you that once the mitzvah is done, you're allowed to benefit from it. Taking it back to our halacha in regards to the incense, you can benefit from the scent of the aroma of the incense after the initial pillar of smoke comes up when it's placed on the fire, because the mitzvah is done and now you can benefit. So taking back, Michael, to your question about the people in Yericho smelling the incense, they may benefit from the aroma because the mitzvah is already done, and that's what the Gemara says. Tashema. Now that we're talking about the Egla Arufa, by Egla Arufa it says that it has to be an animal asher lo ubad ba. The spelling is avad. It was something that you didn't actively work, a calf that you hadn't actively made work. But ubad in the spelling it's pronounced that reflexive, that work had not been done with it. And the Gemara is going to tell us some distinctions and some halacha about this. So hichnisa l'rivka v'dasha. He brought it into its pen, to its corral, and v'dasha. And while there were grains or stalks on the ground, and it stomped on it and got some of the seeds out, essentially threshing, kshera. That's still going to be kosher because it didn't do any work. It just was walking around and it happened to step on some grains. B'shvil shetinik v'tidash. But if you bring it into the corral in order for it to nurse from its mother or to thresh, that's your intention. So it's going to be invalid. You've invalidated it because it did work. So now we have proof from the Egla Arufa itself, from the animal that you're not the calf that you're not allowed to work, or it must be that it wasn't worked. It's going to be invalid for Egla Arufa, even though that you had no other way of doing it. It needed to be safe in its corral, and yet, but since you're intending, it's going to be prohibited. We see that counts as your action. So that seems to prove Rava. Since it says it in the reflexive, no work had been done with it, that tells you mikol in any way that work was done with it, it's going to be prohibited. So Gemara says, well, then if that's the case, so what's the distinction between the first part, where you brought it in without intent for it to thresh these grains, and it did, but you had no intent, you just brought it in there for its safety. Nevertheless, it's going to, in the beginning of the Mishnah, it says it's okay. And according to your reasoning, that since it's in the reflexive, ubad ba, no work had been done with it, so it should be prohibited, even though you had no intent. So now we go to Chavavam and Beis, and the Gemara says, Halay damya elalaha. No, this is going to be different. This is going to be similar to another halacha where the Torah says you're not allowed to work an animal. That's by the para aduma, by the red heifer. And there we learned that shachan alei oif, kshera. It's still valid if a bird landed on the back of of the red heifer. Allah alei zachar. However, if a bull came upon the red heifer, so now psula is going to be invalid. And the reason is because that's actually something that I would want, whereas the bird coming on I'm totally indifferent to that. My time, Amar Papa. So Rav Papa explains, Iksiv, if it had said avad, the active form of you worked the animal, a Korean avad, and you would read it as avad, you worked the animal, ada avid ba'ihu, until you were the one that did work with the animal. Iksiv ubad, if it had said it reflexively in spelling as well as in the way we read it, a Korean and ubad, so then afilu memela, it would be even if a bird landed on it, some work was done with it, even whether I wanted it or not. Hashta the chsiv avad, but it's spelled without the vav, meaning it just spells avad. You worked it, which is active. The Korean and ubad, but it's read with the vowelization of ubad, which means the reflexive. It was work was done with it. So the pronunciation indicates that you don't have to actively work with it, but somehow work was done with it. It's going to be invalid. But the spelling of the word indicates that you have to actively work with it in order to be invalid. So ubad dumida avad. So somehow the reflexive, it happened on its own, is going to be similar to, and it's going to have a component of you working it. Ma avad denichale, meaning just as when you work it, it's with your intent. You want it to be that way. Af ubad denichale. If it happens reflexively, it happened on its own, then also it would have to be that you want it. And therefore, the idea by the Egla Arufa is that if you intended for it to happen, it's going to be prohibited. It's going to be invalidated on account of that. That counts as your work, even though that you didn't do it actively. You didn't pull the animal around to thresh on the threshing floor. You just brought it into the corral, but there were grains there and you intended for it to happen as it was walking around on its own. That, since you intended, it's going to be prohibited. And so it's specific here where the Torah said so. Tashema. So we're going to try and prove Rava's opinion that if you intend to do it, even though you couldn't avoid it, it's going to count as benefit. Aveda, a lost object. You can't spread. You find a lost object, so you're not allowed to benefit from it. You're holding it for the person who lost it. You can't spread it on a bed. You can't spread it on a peg and hang it for your own benefit. So you can't just use it. But if it needs it in order to dry out, in order to for the benefit of the item, so that you can return it in good shape to the owner who lost it, there you're allowed to spread it al gabe mita, whether on a bed, al gabe magod, or on a peg hanging it. Now you have guests, and you say, all right, this beautiful rug that I found needs to be hung to dry out and for its own benefit. And I have guests. I may as well hang it nicely so that it'll look nice. So you're not allowed to hang it. Bein letzarka, whether it's beneficial to the item or only for yourself, for sure not. But even if it's beneficial for the item, you're not allowed to. So you see, it's needed, but since you're intending for your own benefit, so that it looks nice when the guests come, you're not allowed to do it. So it says, Shani Hasam the Kalila. There, it's actually damaging to the item. Why? Either on account of the evil eye that someone's going to look at it with a negative light, and then something bad will happen. Or because when people know that you have that nice item there, it may disappear, and you may not notice. So it's not right to put it out in the spotlight that way, and that's why you're not allowed to do it. But it's still no proof that if you intend and there's no way to avoid it, that it counts as an act, your action and transgression. Tashema, we're going to try and prove it from another halacha. The halacha of having mixed wool and linen in a garment, shatnez. So machri ksus. The halacha is that those that are selling garments in the market, so they're selling a garment that has shatnez. They're not going to sell it to a Jew, but they're selling it in the market. So they can sell machri kedaka, and they can put on the clothing to demonstrate what it's like. They didn't have mannequins, so they became the human mannequin to show it to a customer. They can put it on. As long as they're not intending to shade themselves from the sun in the summer, or shade themselves from the cold, or keep themselves warm in the winter. That's new. However, people that were very particular in doing the right thing, they wouldn't actually put it on. They would just toss it over their shoulders and hold it over them. They bamakel on a stick. They wouldn't actually put it on. In any case, what we see is that it's permissible, since they don't intend, that it's permissible to do this. There's an avoidable way to do it. And yet, and because they're not intending, shari, it's going to be permissible. To yuftal the masni lishna kama the Rava. So the first opinion of Rava, which we said that even according to Rabbi Shimon, who says something that's unintended is going to be prohibited if you could avoid it, that to yufta. Indeed, it's it is a contradiction and a proof against that opinion. So we had two opinions. Ultimately, the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon in any case, that if you don't intend, it's not considered a transgression. So the halacha is, as long as you don't intend, everybody would agree that it's, according to Rabbi Shimon, there's no transgression and it's permissible to do. And that's why over here, the seller is not intending to benefit from the clothing. They're just showing it to a customer. They're just selling their wares, and it's permissible, even though that some people that were particular would avoid it. And that's according to Rabbi Shimon. And the machlokes, the second version, is the one that stands that Abaye and Rava disagree in the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who generally says your intention, if you intend to do, even if you don't intend to do something, transgression, it'll count as a transgression because you did the action. Abaye is going to say if you couldn't avoid it, even if you intended, it's going to be permissible to do. The Mishnah said that you may not heat your oven with chametz after the time that the transgression had set in. What we're going to learn here is that when you use something that's prohibited in benefit to heat your oven, now there's a benefit. Your oven is hot. So there are two types of benefit. One is for a new clay oven, and their ovens were clay. And the new clay oven would become fortified. It would become, I'm forgetting the word for when you dried it and you tempered it. It was tempered. And so the heating of it on the inside is going to actually be an eternal benefit to this. And if your initial heating of the inside of this oven was done with something that's prohibited in benefit, so then the entire oven forever is going to be prohibited because you actually made the oven and fortified the oven with something that's prohibited in benefit. So the benefit lasts forever. However, if you only heated the oven after it's already been used, so you're not tempering it, you're just heating the oven, you may not use the oven until the temperature goes back down to its natural state. Then you can reheat the oven. Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa taught, Tana she'esiku beklipe arloi bekashen shel kelaya keren. If you heated the oven, whether it was with the shells of arla, the first 3 years of produce of fruit from a tree, or with straw from that which wheat grown in a vineyard, which is prohibited and mixed. So chadash, if it's a new oven, which means that the clay needed to be tempered, yutatz, now you have to break the clay apart because you can never use this again because it was tempered with a prohibited heat source. Yashem, however, if it was an old oven, yutzan, all you need is to cool it down in order to not benefit from the heat source. Afabapas, what happens if you actually baked with that? So Rebbe Yomar pas asura. Rebbe says the bread is prohibited because that's a benefit from the fire. The Chachamim say, no, actually, the bread is going to be permissible because we don't consider that the bread benefited from the wood. It benefited from the heat, which was from the gases that came off of the carbonized and burnt up heat source fuel. But the fuel itself is not in the bread. So bishla gabi gecholin. However, if you baked it on top of coals, meaning that it was already totally carbonized, it's no longer the fuel. Now it's just the heat coming off of the already consumed fuel. Everybody agrees, everybody agrees that it's permissible to benefit from this. And so this is what we will see tomorrow, the idea of the heat, the fuel being something that's prohibited in benefit, which in the process of it being consumed gives off this heat, which now bakes something or cooks something. In that process, it's considered, there's a machlokas of whether it's considered that the prohibited item is now somehow in the cooked food, meaning it directly benefited it, and so you're not allowed to benefit from that, or it's secondary. It's only once it's consumed that it gives off the heat, so giving the benefit, and the distinction with coals, which is already post having been consumed. Yashikach.